All right, let's kick off this deep dive. And, today we're going to try and get to the bottom of a question that I think is on a lot of people's minds these days. You know, can China's economy and its technology actually overtake the U.S.?
Yeah, a lot of people are asking that.
Yeah, it's a pretty big question.
It is a big one, yeah.
So we're going to be looking at this interview with Keyu Jin,
Okay,
and she's a professor over at the London School of Economics.
all right.
And she really brings like a super unique perspective to this whole discussion.
Yeah.
And I think some of the stuff she has to say is really going to surprise you. Like, for example, did you know that like 4 of the top 5 most downloaded apps here in the U.S. are actually, made by Chinese companies?
Yeah, that is pretty wild. It's a good example of how much influence China already has, even right here in the U.S., right in the heart of the tech world.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people, maybe don't always realize.
Yeah.
So one of the big things that Jen talks about is this idea that a lot of the things that the U.S. has been doing to try and like slow down China's growth when it comes to technology, things like sanctions, tariffs, all that stuff.
Right.
She actually thinks they might be having the opposite effect.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it seems kind of counterintuitive at
It
first.
does, yeah.
But she makes a really interesting argument. She points to this idea of reverse engineering,
Okay, yeah.
where basically a country will look at existing tech, figure out how it works, break it down, and then use that to, create their own versions.
Yeah, take it apart, see what's inside.
Exactly. And China has gotten like really, really good at doing this.
They have, yeah.
And it's not even just copying.
Right.
She argues that they often take these technologies and actually make them even better.
Yeah, they improve them. They go a step further, even surpassing the original sometimes.
Yeah. And I think to really like understand why this is happening, we have to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
China has this massive domestic market, right?
Right.
They've got tons of financial resources and this business environment that's like incredibly competitive.
Super competitive, yep.
So it's kind of like the perfect recipe for innovation in a way.
Yeah, it creates this pressure cooker almost that forces them to get really good at adapting and innovating.
And so in a way, all these restrictions that were maybe meant to slow them down, they might actually be pushing them to become more self-reliant when it comes to tech.
Yeah, like they're being forced to figure things out on their own.
Yeah, and she uses this analogy that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
She compares it to trying to hold back a river.
Okay.
Like you can do it for a little while, but eventually, the water is going to find a way through.
It'll find its way around over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she even brings up this historical example from the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah.
So basically, Napoleon tried to cut off Britain from trading with anyone.
Right.
But that actually ended up pushing Britain to innovate, to figure out new ways to produce their own goods, and it actually ended up making them stronger.
Wow. So they kind of turned a negative into a positive?
Yeah, they had to. They had to figure it out.
And they had to.
And so she's kind of suggesting that maybe something similar is happening with China.
Yeah, makes sense.
That, by cutting them off from access to certain technologies, it might actually be forcing them to develop their own alternatives.
Right.
And they might even end up leapfrogging ahead in the process.
Yeah, they skip a step and come out stronger.
And we're already kind of seeing this play out.
Where are we seeing it?
Well, for example, in the semiconductor industry, you have companies like Huawei and Tencent that are pouring billions of dollars into chip development.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because they know they need to find ways around these U.S. restrictions.
Yeah. Yeah, they have to in order to survive.
They see this as like essential for their survival.
Right. Yeah.
Especially in a world where technology is so tied up with geopolitics.
It is, yeah.
It's almost like a technological arms race.
It is.
But it's not just about the money.
Okay.
Jin also points to another factor that's really important.
What's that?
And that's the fact that in China, you have all these semiconductor companies that are located really close to the companies that are actually using those chips.
So they're right there together.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people often overlook.
Yeah, that proximity, right.
Yeah, it's this really tight-knit ecosystem, where the chip makers are right next door to the people who are using those chips.
Yeah.
And that creates this really fast feedback loop.
Right. They can test things out quickly, see what works, what doesn't.
Exactly. So there's constant iteration. There's constant improvement happening.
Yeah.
It reminds me of how Japan's semiconductor industry, just like boomed in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, they had a similar kind of setup, right?
Yeah, they had this really close collaboration between the companies that were making the chips and the electronics companies that were using them.
Right. So that close connection really seemed to fuel their growth.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are wondering, could this be the path that China follows as well?
It's definitely possible. It seems like that localized model, combined with all the support they're getting from the government, could be a really powerful combination.
Yeah, and it's something that maybe the U.S. would have a harder time replicating,
Yeah.
because our tech sector is a lot more spread out geographically.
Right. It's not all concentrated in one place like it is in China.
Right, so it's interesting to think about.
It is.
Um, so moving beyond just technology for a second,
Hmm.
Jin also talks about the broader economic impact of China's rise.
Okay.
And she specifically uses this term, the China shock.
The China shock. Okay.
Yeah, have you heard that term before?
I have, but I'd love to hear, what her take on it is exactly.
Yeah, so basically it refers to all the effects, you know, that rippled around the world
Uh-huh.
when China started producing all these low-cost goods, and flooding global markets with them.
Okay, so when China started to become like the factory of the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, this was great for consumers,
Yeah, of course, yeah.
right? Because suddenly we had access to all these cheaper products.
Prices went way down.
And I remember, back in the day, everything from clothes to electronics became so much more affordable.
Yeah, it was a game changer for a lot of people.
It really was.
Yeah, yeah, it was. But, on the other hand, it led to a lot of people losing their jobs in a lot of different countries, particularly in manufacturing.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, especially here in the U.S.
Right, right. So it's kind of like this double-edged sword, good for some but bad for others. And I imagine this is where you start to see a lot of like resentment building up towards China.
Absolutely. Yeah, there were a lot of complicated feelings around it, no easy answers. Jin says, that, yeah, there were negative consequences, but she also argues that a lot of the jobs that were lost to China, they were probably going to disappear anyway, just because of things like automation, and just all the changes happening in the global economy.
Right. So it wasn't necessarily all China's fault.
Right, exactly. It's like, was China really to blame, or was this just the way things were headed anyway?
Right. It's a good question.
It's a big question, and it's important to remember that everybody kind of reacted to this China shock differently, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, like, Jin compares what happened in the U.S. to what happened in Europe.
Okay.
And she says, that European governments, they were a little bit more proactive. They actually invested in things like retraining programs,
Okay.
to help people get new skills and move into different kinds of jobs. And she says that led to a smoother transition in Europe.
So basically the government stepped in and tried to help people adapt.
Exactly, yeah. And it suggests that, even though this China shock was a big deal, there were ways to manage it, through smart policies.
Right. Interesting. So it wasn't just like an unstoppable force. There were things that could be done.
Exactly. Governments could make choices that would affect how it all played out. And this is where things get even more interesting, Jin says, that the whole way we compete with China, it's changing.
Oh, okay. How's
No,
that?
it's not just about those cheap manufactured goods anymore.
Okay.
China is moving up.
Okay.
They want to make more high-tech stuff, renewable energy, even artificial intelligence.
Wow. So they're not just competing on price anymore. They're competing on like sophistication.
Exactly. They're going head-to-head with places like Germany and the South Korea now.
So it's less made in China and more like innovated in China.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to become a real leader in these cutting-edge industries. And that raises a lot of questions about how global trade works,
Uh-huh.
especially the role of the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Right. Yeah. For people who aren't super familiar with the WTO, can you give us like a quick explainer? What is it and why does it matter in this whole China situation?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, the WTO, it's like a set of rules for international trade.
Okay.
It's supposed to make sure things are fair, prevent trade wars.
Right.
The thing is, it was created back when China wasn't really a big player on the global stage.
Yeah. Things have changed a lot since then.
They have, and now that China's the world's second biggest economy, some people say the WTO needs to be updated.
To reflect the new reality, right?
Exactly. And Jin seems to be one of those people. She's pretty critical of how some countries, especially the U.S., have been trying to deal with China, putting tariffs on their own, imposing sanctions without really working with other countries.
Yeah.
She thinks that working through organizations like the WTO, getting everyone on board, that's a much better way to handle these concerns about China's trade practices.
Right. A more multilateral approach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's complicated though, right? I mean, there are valid concerns about stuff like, the way the Chinese government supports their companies with subsidies, accusations of stealing intellectual property.
Yeah.
But then China's argument is, hey, we're just playing by the rules that were already here.
The rules that were mostly written by developed countries.
Exactly. So it's kind of this back and forth.
Like a stalemate almost.
It is, yeah. And figuring out a solution that works for everyone, that's a big challenge.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about what's going on inside China.
Okay.
Jin gets into how the government is actually pushing innovation, within its own borders. And it sounds like it's a lot more than just funding research.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, they're using all these different tools. Jin calls them government-guided funds.
Government-guided funds, okay.
Yeah, and basically what they do is they steer investment into certain industries that the government thinks are really important,
Okay.
like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, renewable energy.
So they're kind of picking winners and losers in a way.
Yeah, they're definitely taking a very active role, that's for sure.
Interesting. And has it been effective?
It has led to a lot of investment in those areas.
Yeah.
But Jin also points out that there are downsides.
Okay, like what?
Like sometimes it leads to inefficiencies.
Okay.
Money gets wasted, because sometimes the projects the government backs, they don't really work out.
They flop.
Yeah, no market for it.
So it's not a perfect system.
No, it's definitely not perfect, but it seems like they're willing to take risks, even if it means some failures along the way.
Right, they're experimenting.
Yeah. And that brings us to another challenge China's facing. Their financial system, it's still pretty young compared to places like the US or Europe.
Oh, okay. I'm curious. How does that affect their ability to innovate, to come up with new ideas and technologies?
Well, think about it like this. In mature financial systems, you've got all these different investors and institutions. They know how to evaluate risks. They know how to allocate capital, money efficiently.
Right.
But in China, a lot of it is still directed by the government, which can lead to, money not always going to the best places.
Right, not the most efficient use of resources.
Exactly. Yeah, and it makes it tough for Chinese companies to get the money they need the traditional way, through investors.
So the government has to step in.
Yeah, they end up giving loans, securing land for development, even helping to organize supply chains.
Wow. It's a much more hands-on approach than we see in a lot of Western countries.
It is, yeah, but it seems to be working for them, at least for now.
It is working, but Jen makes this really important point. She says that for China to keep growing in the long term, they can't just focus on being big.
Okay.
They got to get better at being efficient.
So it's not just about scale anymore, it's about quality, about doing things smarter.
Exactly, yeah. And that might mean taking a step back and letting the market play a bigger role in making economic decisions.
Right, less government control.
Yeah, it sounds like they're kind of at this crossroads right now.
Yeah, they are.
Trying to balance that top-down control with this need for a more dynamic, market-driven approach.
Exactly. And don't forget, all of this is happening in a global context. Remember we were talking about China's growing cultural influence earlier?
Uh-huh. The apps, yeah.
Yeah, the fact that 4 of the top 5 most downloaded apps in the U.S. are Chinese, that's a big deal.
It is, yeah. It says a lot about China's soft power.
Soft power, yeah.
That ability to influence people through culture and ideas.
Exactly. It's not about force or anything like that. It's about getting people to like what you like, to see the world the way you see it.
And I think a lot of people, when they think of soft power, they think of Hollywood movies or American music.
Yeah, that's the classic example.
But it seems like China's finding their own way to project their culture globally.
They are, and these apps, like TikTok, they're incredibly popular all over the world.
Oh, yeah?
And they're not just entertainment. They're shaping tastes, they're shaping trends, even political discussions,
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
It is, and it raises some questions, right? About how these platforms could be used to spread propaganda, maybe even misinformation.
Right. Yeah, that's a valid concern.
It is, and it reminds us that China's rise isn't just an economic story.
Right.
It has big implications for culture, for geopolitics, for everything.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, but also a little bit overwhelming, I have to say.
It is, yeah. It's a lot to take in.
It sounds like China is walking this tightrope, trying to keep its economy growing, keep that momentum going, while also dealing with all these challenges.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act, that's for sure.
And it makes it really hard to predict what's going to happen next.
It does. There are just so many factors at play.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious, what does Jin ultimately think about China's chances? Can they keep this up? Can they really surpass the U.S.?
She doesn't give us any easy answers or make any big predictions.
Okay.
She just keeps saying how complex it all is and how many things could affect what happens.
So she's cautious, but not necessarily like pessimistic.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. She sees the challenges, but she also remembers how China has always adapted in the past, overcome all kinds of
Well,
obstacles.
yeah, they have a pretty impressive track record.
They do, yeah. So I think it's safe to say that China's future is still very much up in the air.
It is, yeah. And it's something that has big implications for all of us, no matter where we live.
Absolutely. It's a story that's still being written.
And one that we'll be following closely for sure. Stay tuned for part 3 of this deep dive, where we'll explore what China's rise means for the future of global leadership and innovation. So we've spent a lot of time talking about China's economic and technological rise, but I think the question on a lot of people's minds is like, so what? What does this actually mean for the rest of the world, for people like us?
That's the big question, right? And it's one that's not easy to answer, but one thing we can say for sure is that China's rise is changing things in a big way.
It's like we're seeing a whole new set of players on the global stage.
It is, and the old rules might not apply anymore.
Right, so we're moving away from a world where the U.S. was the only superpower
Yeah, the US was calling the shots for a long time.
to a world where power is spread out among several different players.
Exactly. It's what people call a multipolar system.
Multipolar. I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I totally get it. Like, what does that look like in practice?
Well, imagine a world where no single country is in charge.
Okay.
You've got multiple centers of power, each with their own interests and their own influence.
Okay.
Think of it like a three-legged stool, maybe,
Okay.
where the US is one leg, China's another, and maybe the European Union is the third.
So instead of one dominant player, it's more complex.
Much more complex, yeah.
And probably more unpredictable, too.
Definitely. And that can be kind of scary, especially for countries like the US that are used to being on top.
It's like the ground is shifting under their feet and they're not sure what to do.
Exactly. There's a lot of anxiety about losing that top spot.
But it seems like Jin doesn't see this as like a winner-take-all situation.
Right. She doesn't think it has to be one country wins and the other loses.
Yeah, she thinks there's room for both competition and cooperation.
She does, and she even argues that competition can be a good thing.
How so?
Well, it can push countries to innovate more, to be better.
So it's not about trying to contain China, it's about figuring out how to compete and maybe even find ways to work together.
That's a good way to put it.
Are there areas where that would actually make sense?
Absolutely. Think about things like climate change,
Okay, yeah,
or global health issues, or cybersecurity.
right. Those are big global problems.
Exactly. And no one country can solve those on their own. Everyone needs to work together.
Like we're all in the same boat, even if we're rowing in slightly different directions.
I like that analogy. It really captures the situation. We got to figure out how to navigate these choppy waters together.
But let's be real. There's a lot of distrust between the U.S. and China.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We see it in the trade disputes, the tension over Taiwan.
Right. And there are accusations of spying, stealing intellectual property.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. But if we want to deal with those issues, we got to start by talking to each other.
Diplomacy, right.
Exactly. Diplomacy and a willingness to build trust. And that takes time. It's not going to happen overnight.
It sounds like we need a whole new approach to international relations.
I think you're right. Something that can handle this more complicated world.
Right, where there's not just one superpower calling all the shots.
Exactly. And it's not just governments that need to talk. It's businesses, universities,
Even just regular people.
everyone. The more we can connect and understand each other, the better.
Right. Break down those barriers that lead to suspicion.
Exactly. And that's where I think this whole conversation becomes really relevant for you, the listener.
Okay, I'm listening. How does this connect to our everyday lives?
Well, whether you realize it or not, China's rise is already affecting you.
In what ways?
It affects the things you buy, the jobs that are available, the whole global economy.
So it's not just some abstract thing happening on the other side of the world.
Not at all. And as China gets more powerful, it's only going to have a bigger impact.
So we need to pay attention.
We do. And we need to understand what's going on and think about how we want to engage with this rising power.
It's a lot to think about, and I think this deep dive has given us a good starting point.
I hope so. It's clear that the world is changing fast.
And China is a big part of that change.
A huge part. And while there are definitely challenges and a lot of uncertainty, there are also opportunities.
For those who are willing to adapt, right?
Exactly. So what's the takeaway here? What should we be doing?
As individuals.
Stay curious, keep learning, and don't be afraid to think critically about these issues.
Right. It's not about becoming a China expert overnight.
No, it's about being aware of what's happening and forming your own opinions.
And remembering that this is a story that's still being written.
Exactly. The choices we make today will shape the future.
So let's make sure it's a future where cooperation and innovation win out.
I couldn't agree more. A more prosperous and peaceful future for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We hope you found it insightful, and we'll see you next time.